Gideon Blackwell didn't knock. He never did. He pushed open the door to Vivian Ashcroft's ranch office like he owned it already. Because in his mind, he did. He dropped a folded document on her desk without a word, then pulled out a pocket watch, checked the time, and said, "You've got until Friday to sign. After that, I stop being generous." Vivian looked at the paper. It was an offer. Barely a third of what the land was worth. "This isn't generous," she said. "This is an insult." Blackwell smiled the way men smile when they've already won and just haven't told you yet. "Your water's drying up, Mrs. Ashcroft. Your cattle are already stressed. By spring, you won't have a ranch. You'll have a very expensive piece of dirt." He picked up his hat from the chair he hadn't been invited to sit in. Friday. He left the door open on his way out. If you've ever watched someone try to take everything from a woman who had already lost too much and watched her refuse to break, then this story is for you. Hit that like button, drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Let's get into it. The 6 weeks were supposed to be simple. Elias Mercer had learned, over the better part of a decade moving from ranch to ranch across Wyoming and Montana, that simple was the only thing worth counting on. You showed up, you worked until your hands cracked and your back stopped asking questions. You collected your wages, and you moved on before anything got complicated. Before people started expecting things from you that you couldn't promise. Before you started expecting things from yourself. He had a system. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. The Ashcroft Ranch had come to him by way of a posting tacked to a board outside a feed store in Casper. Experienced ranch hands needed. Immediate start. Fair wages. The name Ashcroft rang a distant bell. He'd heard something about old Robert Ashcroft dying in a riding accident the previous winter, leaving behind a young wife and 5,000 acres of the best grazing land in the county. He hadn't given it much thought. He needed the work. He took the job. The morning he rode in, he expected to meet a foreman. Instead, he met Vivian. She was standing in the middle of the yard when he arrived, holding a leather-bound ledger in one arm and gesturing with the other at two men who were arguing about the positioning of a water trough. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. There was something in her manner, a kind of stillness beneath the movement, that made people pay attention without understanding quite why. She looked up when his horse came through the gate and studied him the way a person studies something they're trying to decide about. Not hostile, not warm either, just assessing. "Elias Mercer?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You listed land surveying in your previous work. That true?" He hadn't expected that to be the first question. 4 years, before ranching. She nodded once, like she was filing it away. "Can you start today?" He said yes. He always said yes. What he didn't say, what he hadn't said to any employer in years, was that the ranch was already in worse shape than the posting had suggested. He could see it in the way the fencing leaned in the south pasture, in the dry ring around the water trough that told him the creek feeding the property had been running low for weeks, in the faces of the two remaining hands, who looked at Vivian's back with the particular expression of men who had already half decided to leave. He kept those observations to himself. He picked up a post-hole digger and went to work. By the end of that first week, the two remaining hands had quit. One of them, a man named Doyle, with sun-cracked knuckles and a habit of spitting before he spoke, stopped Elias on his way to the barn one evening. "She's going to lose it," Doyle said. It wasn't malicious, it was the flat, tired voice of a man who'd watched things fall apart too many times to be surprised by it anymore. No woman can run a spread this size alone, and nobody worth hiring is going to work for her long. "I'm still here," Elias said. Doyle looked at him the way people look at someone who hasn't yet realized the joke is on them. "For now." He picked up his saddle and walked to his horse. Elias watched him go. Then he went inside and found Vivian at the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of her, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow. She had the look of someone doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong no matter how many times they run it. "Doyle's gone," Elias said. She didn't look up. "I know." "So is Hennessy." "I know that too." She turned a page. "I'll put up another posting." "You don't need a posting," Elias said. "You need water." That made her look up. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her without being asked, which was either bold or presumptuous depending on how she chose to take it. She didn't ask him to leave. He took that as a sign to continue. "The creek's running about 40% of what it should be this time of year," he said. I walked the east property line this afternoon. The flow's been reduced upstream. Could be natural blockage, could be something else, but either way, your cattle are going to start dropping condition inside of 3 weeks if it doesn't change. Vivian set down her pen. I know about the creek. Have you ridden up to see the source? I've been occupied keeping this ranch from collapsing. I understand that. He kept his voice even. But the water problem isn't going to solve itself. She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't tell if she was deciding whether to trust him or deciding whether to be annoyed by him. Possibly both. I'll ride up Saturday, she said. I'll go with you. She picked her pen back up. All right. That was the beginning of it. Not dramatic, not marked by any moment either of them would have pointed to afterward and said, there. That was when things changed. Just two people at a table talking about water and cattle and what needed doing, while outside the wind moved through the dry grass and the first edge of autumn made itself known in the cooling air. He stayed past 6 weeks. He didn't entirely know why, at first. He told himself it was the work. There was always something that needed doing, always a reason to stay one more week. He told himself it was professional pride. He'd never left a property in worse shape than he found it. He didn't let himself think too carefully about the other reasons. Vivian Ashcroft was not an easy person to know. She was guarded in the way that people become when they've had to fight for things that should have been given without a fight. She didn't talk much about Robert, her late husband, except in practical terms. The decisions he'd made, the debts he'd left, the things she'd had to learn after his death, because he hadn't thought to teach her while he was alive. Elias noticed she never said his name with bitterness. She said it the way you say the name of something that shaped you and is gone now, and you're still figuring out what shape you're left in. What she was good at, better than she likely knew, was the land itself. She understood the cattle intuitively, the way some people understand horses, like she could read their condition in a glance and know what it meant. She kept meticulous records. She caught errors in supplier invoices that men with twice her experience would have missed. She was learning, fast and without complaint, the parts of running the ranch that hadn't been her domain before. What she needed was time she didn't have, and men who would work for her without treating every instruction like an argument. Elias wasn't interested in arguments. He was interested in the work. That, apparently, was unusual enough to matter. They rode up to the creek source on the Saturday he'd suggested, Vivian on her gray mare and Elias on the bay he'd been assigned. The morning was cold, the sky that particular scrubbed blue that comes after autumn rains, and for most of the ride they didn't talk. Not because things were uncomfortable, because neither of them was the kind of person who filled silence for its own sake. The creek wound through a narrow canyon about 2 miles northeast of the main house. When they reached the point where the water should have been flowing at full capacity, Elias pulled up his horse and dismounted without a word. He walked the bank. He crouched and looked at the waterline markings on the rock. He walked further upstream. There, he said. Vivian dismounted and came to look where he was pointing. Upstream, where the canyon narrowed, a rough earthen berm had been built across a section of the water flow. It was subtle, not the kind of thing you'd notice unless you knew what you were looking for. But it was clearly not natural. The soil was too dark and too recently disturbed. Someone built that, Vivian said. Yes. She stood there for a moment. The water moving around the partial dam made a sound like something trying to get past something that wouldn't let it through. Blackwell, she said. It wasn't a question. Elias didn't answer right away. He studied the construction, the angle of it, the way it sat in the canyon. You'd need proof before you say that to anyone official. I know who that man is and what he wants. Her voice had gone very quiet. He's been circling this ranch for 2 years, since before Robert died. What do you mean, circling? She turned away from the water and walked back to her horse. He's bought 4 properties bordering ours in the last 3 years, little by little, always at times when the owners were under pressure. She stopped, one hand on the saddle. He made me an offer last month, 30 cents on the dollar. You didn't take it. No. He would have known you wouldn't. She looked at him over her shoulder. Then this, she gestured back at the dam, is his way of changing the terms. Elias walked back to his horse. He stood there for a moment, thinking. We need to document everything, he said. Photographs if you can get them. Written measurements, the date we found it. The water levels before and after. He paused. And we need to talk to your neighbors. My neighbors are mostly afraid of Blackwell. Some of them are. Not all. He swung up into the saddle. The ones who aren't, the ones who've held on, they've been watching. They'll have stories. Maybe testimony. Vivian mounted and turned her horse toward home. You're talking about a legal fight. I'm talking about building the evidence for one, before it gets to that. She was quiet for a long stretch of trail. He didn't push it. Why? She finally asked, not accusatory, genuinely wanting to know. Because you have the right to that water, and because someone's trying to take it from you by going around the law instead of through it. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. And because I know what the law says, and it says you'd win if you can prove what happened. She didn't say anything to that. But when they got back to the ranch and put up the horses, and she went inside to make coffee, she left the door open, which, he'd come to understand, was Vivian's version of an invitation. He followed her in. The weeks that followed were the hardest he'd worked since his surveying days. Mornings started before first light, moving cattle to closer pastures where water wasn't an issue, rationing carefully, making every drop count. Afternoons, after the heaviest ranch work was done, he and Vivian rode the county. They visited ranchers who'd sold to Blackwell under pressure. They found 3 who had documents showing Blackwell's men had interfered with their water in the years before they finally broke. They found an old man named Cowboy, who had been using that creek lawfully since before half the county was settled, and who had the written records to prove it. Cowboy was 82 years old and moved slow, but his memory was exact. He sat across a table from Vivian and Elias in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee, and he talked for 2 hours about the creek's history and the use of it. When he was done, he said, "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. That man Blackwell bought my neighbor's land, and he tried to buy mine. I told him where he could put his offer." Vivian smiled, a real one, which was rarer than the polite ones, and worth 3 times as much. "Thank you, Mr. Cowboy," she said. The old man looked at Elias. "That your husband?" Elias opened his mouth. "He works for me," Vivian said, calm as anything. Cowboy looked between them with the particular knowingness of a very old man who has seen a great deal of human behavior and is not fooled by very much of it. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. The nights were harder to navigate than the work. Elias had a bunkhouse to sleep in, and he used it. But it became natural, gradually, for him to sit on the porch with Vivian after supper, while the sky went through its colors and then went dark. They talked about the case they were building, mostly. Sometimes they talked about other things, about the land and how it changed through the seasons, about the ways ranching had shifted in the years since the big cattle drives, about small things that didn't matter particularly. One evening she asked him why he'd left surveying. I was quiet for a while. Got complicated, he said eventually. She didn't push. She'd learned by then that he would tell her things when he was ready and not before, and that pressing him produced nothing except a wall. A week later, without prompting, he told her. A business partner who'd misrepresented their work. A property dispute that had gone wrong in ways Elias still felt responsible for, even though the courts had eventually ruled otherwise. The sense, afterward, that he'd lost something. Not just the work, but his confidence in his own judgment. "Ranching doesn't require you to trust your judgment about people," he said. "Just about cattle and weather and ground." "That's not entirely true," Vivian said. "I know." He looked out at the dark. "I've been figuring that out." She was quiet for a moment, then, "For what it's worth, your judgment about people seems fine to me." He looked at her. She was looking at the stars, her hands around her coffee cup, her profile in the lamplight. Something he'd stopped pretending not to notice. "You're not the most objective sample," he said. She glanced over with something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "No," she agreed. "Probably not." It was the kind of conversation that meant something without either of them saying what it meant. The documentation took 6 weeks in total. 6 weeks of writing and recording and convincing and sitting at Vivian's kitchen table until midnight, organizing what they'd gathered into something a judge would take seriously. By the time they finished, they had signed testimony from 9 separate landowners, Calloway's historical records, Elias's own surveying measurements of the water diversion, and a written account from a county records clerk who confirmed that Blackwell's legal claim on the creek, which he filed quietly in the middle of their documentation process, like a man playing a card he'd been holding for months, had been filed after every one of their documented dates of lawful use. The night they finished, Vivian made dinner, actually made it, not just heated something, and they sat at the table surrounded by stacked papers and ate something approaching a real meal, which was unusual enough that it felt like a marker of something. "We have a case," Elias said. "We have a good case," Vivian corrected. "Same thing." "It's not the same thing." She refilled his coffee without being asked. "A case is what you walk into the courthouse with. A good case is what you walk out of it with." He looked at her. "When did you get optimistic?" "When I stopped being scared." She said it simply, like she was reporting weather. "About 2 weeks ago, I realized I'd stopped waking up at 3 in the morning panicking. I hadn't noticed until it stopped." He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that he'd noticed, and that he'd been relieved, and that the relief had told him more about how much he cared than he was entirely comfortable with. "We file Monday," he said instead. "Monday," she agreed. He helped her clear the dishes. They moved around the kitchen the way people move around each other when they've been sharing a space long enough that they've stopped thinking about it, adjusted, automatic, each aware of where the other was without having to look. He almost said something, at the door, when he was leaving. He didn't. He walked to the bunkhouse in the cold night air and lay on his cot staring at the ceiling for longer than he wanted to admit, listening to the wind and thinking about what it meant to stay somewhere long enough to stop thinking about leaving. And what happened to you when that stopped being temporary and became something else entirely? Outside, the creek ran lower than it should have. In the morning, they would go back to work. There was always more work. The ranch demanded it, and neither of them was the kind of person who argued with what needed doing. But underneath all of it, something had shifted that neither of them had named yet. And the not naming of it had its own weight, its own presence, like a third person sitting quietly in every room. Autumn was deepening. The mountains to the west held snow on their upper reaches now, white above the tree line, and the nights came earlier and bit harder. The valley was beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when you know they're also about to get difficult. Elias had been here 4 months. He'd stopped counting weeks. The morning before he planned to tell Vivian he thought he should go, before things got any more complicated than he was equipped to handle, was the morning Blackwell's men expanded the dam. He found out when he went to check the cattle at first light and discovered the small spring-fed pool in the north pasture, which had been their backup water source, had dropped by half overnight. He stood there for a moment in the gray early light, steam coming off his breath, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. He felt genuinely angry. He went back to the house. He knocked. Vivian answered the door already dressed, because she was always already dressed, coffee already made. Like sleep was just something that happened to her briefly, and she refused to let it slow her down. He said, "They hit the north tributary. We need to ride up there now." She looked at him. She went inside and came back with her rifle in her coat. They rode. The north tributary was worse than he'd feared. Elias pulled his horse up at the canyon's edge and looked down at what had been, just 3 days ago, a decent secondary flow. Nothing compared to the main creek, but enough to carry the north pasture cattle through a dry stretch. Now there was a brown trickle working its way around a mass of fresh-packed earth and heavy timber that hadn't been there on Monday. Someone had worked through the night. Multiple men, from the look of it. The diversion structure was twice the size of the original dam upstream, and built with a kind of rough competence that told him this wasn't the first time Blackwell's people had done this. Vivian sat her horse beside him and said nothing for a long moment. "He didn't wait," she said finally. "He's been waiting 2 years." Elias dismounted and handed her his reins. "He's done waiting." He picked his way down the bank carefully, the ground still soft from the work that had been done in the dark. He crouched at the edge of the new structure and studied it. Fresh timber. The kind of heavy posts you'd need to haul in by wagon. You couldn't do this on horseback, not with materials this size, which meant tracks. He walked downstream 20 yards, then upstream, reading the ground the way he'd been trained to read it, and found what he was looking for. Wagon ruts pressed deep into the soft soil on the east bank, where the canyon widened just enough to bring a loaded rig through. He pulled out the small notebook he'd been carrying since this whole thing started and wrote down what he saw. Date, time, description, measurements where he could take them. He'd learned in the surveying years that the detail you didn't write down was always the one you needed 6 months later in front of someone who wasn't there. Vivian had dismounted and come down to the bank while he was working. She watched him without interrupting, which was something he'd come to appreciate about her. She didn't fill spaces with noise. Wagon came in from the east, he said without looking up. More than one trip, probably. This took hours. Our nearest eastern boundary touches Blackwell's Creston parcel. She'd been doing her own reading of the landscape. He could have come straight through his own land, which means we can't prove trespass on our property, only on the waterway. He stood up and looked at the structure again. But we don't need trespass. We need interference. This is interference. He tapped the notebook. Documented. Vivian looked at the dammed water and then looked away, toward the north pasture where the cattle were. Even from here, if you knew what you were looking for, you could read the signs, the way the animals clustered around the edges of the drying pool, the way they moved restlessly. Cattle didn't panic the way horses did. They just got quieter and quieter, which was in some ways worse. We've got maybe 2 weeks before the north herd starts dropping conditions seriously, she said. 1 week if it doesn't rain. She looked at the sky, which was the flat gray of early November with no promise of anything. It's not going to rain. No, he agreed. They looked at each other. I need to move 30 head to the south pasture, she said. That's going to crowd the south water. I know. And I need to do it today, before the pool drops further. I'll start after we're done here. She nodded. She started up the bank to the horses, then stopped. Elias. She said his name the way she said most things, carefully, like she'd considered it first. He knows we filed. Probably. This is his answer. I know that. He's not trying to negotiate anymore. He's trying to destroy the ranch's value before the hearing, so we don't have anything worth fighting for. Elias climbed the bank and took his reins back from her. Then we don't let him. She looked at him. Not softly. Vivian Ashcroft didn't do anything softly, exactly. But with something that went past the practical, past the logistics and the cattle counts and the water measurements. For just a second, something underneath all of it showed through. Then she turned and mounted, and they rode back toward the ranch without speaking, because there wasn't anything useful left to say, and both of them knew it. The cattle move took the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon. It was hard, unglamorous work, cutting 30 animals out of the north herd, which did not want to be cut, pushing them across 2 miles of broken terrain and settling them into a south pasture that was already at capacity and made its objections known through every animal in it. By the time it was done, Elias's horse was lathered and his back was saying things he didn't want to hear, and Vivian had a long, shallow cut on her forearm from a fence wire that had snapped back when she wasn't watching it. She wrapped it herself with a strip of cloth from her saddlebag and kept working, which was exactly what he expected, and also the kind of thing that lodged itself somewhere in his chest and stayed there. They ate supper late that night. Vivian made something simple, beans and bread and whatever was at hand, and they sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork spread around them and Elias's notebook open between them. We need to tell the attorney, she said, first thing tomorrow. He's going to want to file an emergency injunction. Probably. Elias pushed food around his plate. It'll take time. These things always take time. We don't have time. I know. He looked at the notebook. But we have documentation, and we have Calloway's testimony and the others. Blackwell's legal claim to the creek was filed after every date we have documented. The injunction will be based on that. He paused. The judge will look at the timeline, and he'll see what it is. Vivian was quiet for a moment. You've been through something like this before. Not exactly like this, but close. He considered what to tell her. The surveying situation I mentioned, the partner who misrepresented our work, it ended up in a kind of dispute like this. Not water rights, but property line fraud. Similar mechanics. He put his fork down. We lost at first. The other party had more money and more patience, and they just wore the process down. Filed things late to force delays, used every procedural tool they could find. She was watching him steadily. We won eventually, on appeal. He looked at the notebook. But by then the original client had already sold under pressure, and the sale couldn't be undone. Winning didn't fix what it should have fixed. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Is that why you left surveying? It wasn't really a question. He answered it anyway. Part of it. He looked at her. The part that doesn't leave you is the feeling that you knew, and you couldn't move fast enough, and someone paid for that. She nodded slowly. Then we move fast. We move fast, he agreed. The attorney, a compact, precise man named Aldridge, who practiced out of a two-room office above a hardware store in the county seat, received them the next morning with the focused attention of someone who billed by the hour and respected people who came prepared. Elias laid out the notebook, the documentation, the photographs Vivian had managed to get of the dam sites, and the organized stack of testimony they'd spent 6 weeks building. Aldridge went through it without rushing. He asked 3 or 4 questions, made his own notes, and then sat back in his chair. "You have more than most people walk in here with," he said. "The filing dates alone are significant. Blackwell's attorney would have known about these prior use records if he'd done proper due diligence, which means either he didn't or he chose not to." He looked at the photographs. The second dam complicates things slightly because it's on the tributary rather than the main creek, but the principle is the same: documented interference with established water rights. "Can we get an injunction?" Vivian asked. "I can file for one. I won't promise you the speed of it. The judge handling water rights cases in this district is thorough, which means slow." Aldridge looked at her directly. "I need you to be prepared for a wait." "How long?" 6 weeks for the injunction hearing, if we're fortunate. Could be 8. Elias watched Vivian's face. He saw the calculation happen. 6 to 8 weeks against the water situation at the ranch, against the condition of the cattle, against the temperature dropping every day. "File it," she said. "There's also the matter of cost," Aldridge began. "File it," she said again. "I'll manage the cost." Aldridge looked at her for a moment, then nodded once, and pulled a clean sheet of paper toward himself. They rode home in the early afternoon, the road quiet between them, the mountains on the west showing more white than they had a week ago. 6 weeks, Vivian said at some point, not to him specifically, just to the air in front of her. "We'll manage the cattle." "With what water?" "We haul from the south tank to the north pasture if we have to. It's labor-intensive and it's slow, but it's doable." "Every day for 6 weeks." "Every day for 6 weeks." She rode in silence. Her mare's hooves were steady on the road, and the sound of them was almost rhythmic, almost peaceful, in a way that had nothing to do with how either of them felt. "You don't have to stay for this," she said. He looked at her. "I know." "I mean it. This isn't what you hired on for. Water hauling every day for 2 months, a legal fight, the uncertainty of it." "Vivian." He said it plainly, without heat. "Stop." She glanced over. "I know what I'm staying for," he said. "I don't need you to make it easier for me to leave." Something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read, and he'd gotten reasonably good, over the past months, at reading her face. Then she looked back at the road. "All right," she said. They didn't talk about it any further than that, but something had been said. In the plainest terms, either of them seemed capable of at the moment, and it sat between them differently than the silence before had. The days that followed were the hardest work Elias had done since he could remember. He and Vivian, just the two of them, because Vivian had hired on a young man named Tate who was willing and reasonably capable but not yet experienced enough to work independently on the harder tasks. Hauled water from the south tank to the north pasture every morning before the other work started. It meant loading a wagon before first light, driving it across rough ground, and hand distributing to trough points that weren't designed for manual supply. It was the kind of work that wore into your shoulders and your patience in equal measure. Tate was 19 and talked more than both of them combined, which Elias found irritating in the early mornings and something approaching charming by the afternoons, when the silence could start to feel too heavy. One morning, loading the wagon in the dark, Tate said, "How come she didn't sell?" "When Blackwell offered. My uncle said most folks would have taken that money and gone somewhere easier." Elias climbed up to the wagon seat. "This is her ranch." "Yeah, but it's her ranch," he said again. "That's the whole answer." Tate thought about that and apparently found it satisfactory because he dropped it and climbed up beside him. But the question stayed with Elias through the morning's work, not because he didn't understand the answer, but because he'd been thinking about the shape of it, about what it meant to belong to a piece of land the way Vivian belonged to this one. He'd never had that. He'd moved through places, worked them, learned their particular requirements, and left. He'd been good at it. He told himself that was a form of freedom. He was becoming less certain about that than he used to be. The neighbors came one by one in the second week after Aldridge filed the injunction. Not the big landholders, the men in Blackwell's orbit who had business dealings with him and weren't about to risk those for a widow's water rights case. But the smaller ones. Calloway came himself, which surprised Elias because the drive from his spread was hard on a man his age, and he came with his own signed affidavit adding new details he'd remembered since their first meeting. A woman named Pratt, who ran a sheep operation east of Vivian's property, brought a folder of her own correspondence, letters she'd received from Blackwell's agent 2 years ago, trying to acquire her grazing rights. She'd refused then. She was still refusing now, and she wanted Vivian to know that. A man named Deering brought his 2 adult sons and sat at Vivian's kitchen table for 2 hours going through everything Aldridge had filed, asking careful questions, and then said he'd provide additional testimony about a drainage dispute on his own property that he believed connected to Blackwell's broader pattern. Vivian thanked each of them with the focused sincerity of someone who understood exactly what it cost them to be here. Not effusive, not overwhelmed, just honest. After Deering and his sons left, she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her back to Elias, hands on the edge of the counter. "I didn't expect this," she said. "People don't like being watched while they make up their minds," he said. "They come when they're ready." "He's pushed a lot of people around for a long time," she turned. "They're angry. I don't think they knew they could do something with it. They can now." She looked at the table where the paperwork was spread, the record of every person who'd come in, every statement added. "This is bigger than my water rights. It's been bigger than that since Blackwell started buying land," Elias said. "Your case just gave it a shape." She nodded slowly, thinking something through that he didn't interrupt. "Then we win it right," she said finally. The third week brought the first real crisis. One of the North herd cattle, a 5-year-old cow that had been borderline in condition since the water reduction started, went down in the north pasture on a Tuesday morning. Elias found her when he came to check after the water haul. He knelt next to her and knew within 60 seconds it wasn't just dehydration, though that had weakened her. It was pneumonia. The cold nights and the stress had opened the door for it. He went back to the house. He didn't soften it. "Lost one this morning. Pneumonia, I think. There might be more." Vivian set down her coffee. "How many show symptoms?" "2 others I can see. Could be more by nightfall." She thought for a moment. "Get Tate to ride for the veterinarian in Larimer. I need prices on supplemental feed. I can move some cattle further south to a neighbor's land if he'll allow it. That might reduce the stress on the herd." "Who's the neighbor?" "Pratt. She came for us. I think she'd agree." "I'll ride over myself." "I'll go," she said. "You stay with the herd." He watched her pull on her coat and hat with the efficiency of someone who didn't have energy to waste on feelings she couldn't afford right now. He understood that. "Vivian." She stopped at the door. "We're not losing this." She looked at him. "We might lose a few cattle." "That's not the same thing." She held his gaze for a second. Then she went out the door. Pratt agreed to take 20 head on a temporary arrangement with fair terms. Vivian came back with the deal settled and an additional offer from Pratt, a letter to the court stating her willingness to share water access during the dispute period, which Aldridge said when they called on him the next day would strengthen the injunction argument considerably by demonstrating good faith community water management. They lost 2 cattle in the end, not 3. The veterinarian caught the pneumonia cases early enough that the rest of the affected animals pulled through with treatment and shelter. 2 animals. It shouldn't have felt like a personal defeat, and Elias knew it didn't to Vivian on a rational level. But he watched her the evening after the second one went down, and he saw the thing that happened in her face. The private accounting she did, the way she absorbed a cost without showing it to anyone, and he felt it like something pressing on his own chest. He didn't say anything consoling. He'd learned she didn't want that. What she wanted was someone who understood without needing to perform understanding. He made coffee. He poured 2 cups. He put one in front of her and sat down across the table. She looked at the cup. After a moment, she wrapped her hands around it. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the coffee. For something larger that neither of them named." "Sure," he said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing against the house in long, low surges. The temperature was dropping. The paperwork was on the table between them, and the case was as strong as they could make it, and the injunction hearing was 3 weeks away, and neither of them could control what came next. What they could control was this: the work, the preparation, the willingness to sit here at this table and not pretend that any of it was easy, and not pretend either that it was going to break them. Elias refilled his cup. Then he refilled hers without being asked. She let him, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had said out loud. The following week, Blackwell made a move none of them had anticipated. Not legal, not physical. Something worse in a way because it was social and therefore harder to counter. He invited the county commissioner, a man named Hollis, to a dinner at his estate. And somewhere during that dinner, the nature of Vivian's case, the details of what she was filing and why, became known to three of the most influential landowners in the county, along with Blackwell's version of those details, which bore only a passing resemblance to the facts. Elias found out because Deering's eldest son rode over on a Friday morning and told him in the barn, speaking quietly with the urgency of someone delivering something they wish they didn't have to. Blackwell's saying she's trying to claim water rights that historically belong to open range, he said. That if she wins, it sets a precedent that allows any private landowner to cut off shared waterways. He's framing it as a threat to every small rancher in the county. Elias straightened up from where he'd been working on a piece of tack. That's backwards from what's actually happening. I know that, but the commissioner doesn't, and Hollis talks to half the county. Elias thought for a moment. Does your father know? Came straight to you first. Tell him. Tell Calloway too if you can get out there. And Mrs. Pratt. He paused. We need people talking back before that version sets. Deering's son nodded and was back on his horse inside a minute. Elias went to find Vivian. She was in the north pasture checking the recovering cattle with Tate, and she turned when she heard him coming, and whatever was on his face told her something was wrong before he said a word. He told her plainly. She listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change much, which was a sign, he'd learned, that she was angrier than she was letting out. He's smart, she said when he finished. He's been doing this a long time. He's trying to turn the neighbors against us, the ones we haven't reached yet. She looked out at the cattle. If the local sentiment shifts against this case before the hearing, the judge will feel it. These things don't happen in a vacuum. No, he agreed. Then we talk to people. She pulled off her work gloves and tucked them in her coat pocket. Starting today. Vivian, it's nearly noon. We've got the afternoon water haul. Tate can manage the water haul. Tate, who had clearly heard his name and was pretending he hadn't, stood very still nearby. You sure about that? Elias said. He's done it 3 times with us, Vivian said. He knows the route. She raised her voice without turning. Tate. Yes, ma'am. Tate appeared with the studied promptness of someone who had indeed been listening the whole time. You can handle the afternoon haul alone? He straightened slightly. Yes, ma'am. I can do that. She looked at Elias. Ready? He looked at her, coat dusty, a smear of something on her left boot, hair escaping from its pins at the back of her neck, eyes absolutely certain of what she was doing, and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as the opposite of the restlessness that had defined the last several years of his life. He was ready. He was, in fact, not going anywhere. Let's ride, he said. They spent 3 days making the rounds. They visited 8 properties, sat in 7 kitchens, drank a great deal of coffee they didn't always want, and told the actual story, with the documentation, with the timeline, with the clarity that came from having spent months building an honest account of what had happened. They didn't attack Blackwell directly. They just laid out facts and let people look at them. It was Vivian who was best at this. Elias had the legal knowledge and the surveying background and the ability to explain the technical elements in plain language. But it was Vivian they trusted, because she was one of them. Not an outsider, not a hired hand, but a woman who had been on this land and was fighting to stay on it. When she spoke without drama, and that made people believe her in a way that drama couldn't have. By the 3rd evening, riding home in the cold dark, Elias felt the shift in the shape of things. Not certain, not clean, but real. You did well, he said. We did well. You specifically. He meant it. In Harlan Pruitt's kitchen this afternoon, the way you laid it out for him. He came in skeptical, and he left ready to write a letter. She was quiet for a moment. I've been watching how you explain things, she said. The way you start with what's actually true and don't apologize for it. He looked at her, but it was dark on the road and he couldn't see her face clearly. You've been doing that since before I got here, he said. She made a sound that might have been disagreement or might have been something less defined. They rode the rest of the way home without talking, the horses moving through the cold at a steady, tired pace. The house was dark when they got back. Tate had finished his work and gone, leaving a note on the door in careful handwriting. Waterhaul done. North trough full. 2 cows checked and doing better. T. Vivian read it twice. He's going to be good, she said. He's already decent. Elias took the horses to the barn. Give him a year. She went inside to light the lamps. He unsaddled both horses and rubbed them down and made sure they were settled before he came in, which took longer than usual because he was tired in the way that went past his body and into something harder to name. He came through the back door to find Vivian at the stove, not making anything elaborate, just heating what was there, the kitchen filling with the smell of something warm. She didn't look up when he came in. There's enough for 2, she said. He hung up his coat and hat. He sat down at the table. Through the window, the night was very dark and very cold, and in 3 weeks there would be a hearing that would decide more than either of them could fully afford to think about. But the case was strong. The neighbors were behind them. The documentation was solid. And here, in this kitchen, for this hour, the work was done. That had to be enough. Elias put his hands flat on the table and looked at them, the work in them, the months in them, and thought that maybe he had been wrong about simple. Maybe simple was never really the point. Maybe the point was something more like this: a table, a lamp, a window showing winter dark, and 2 people who had decided, without much ceremony, that they weren't going to let go. The injunction hearing was set for a Thursday. On the Wednesday before it, Blackwell made one more move. He didn't come himself. He sent his attorney, a man named Croft, who wore his suits like a second skin and spoke the way certain men speak when they've learned that confidence, performed correctly, can substitute for honesty. Croft arrived at the Ashcroft Ranch at mid-morning in a hired buggy, stepped down without hurrying, and walked to the front door like a man who had been expected. Elias was in the yard when he arrived. He watched Croft cross the distance from the gate without moving from where he stood. Croft looked at him. I'm here to see Mrs. Ashcroft. I know who you are, Elias said. Something shifted very slightly in Croft's expression. Not discomfort, just recalibration. Then you know the matter is between my client and the property owner. The property owner employs me. Elias didn't raise his voice. Wait here. He went inside and found Vivian in the office, going through a final review of the documents for tomorrow. She looked up when he came in. Croft's here, Elias said, Blackwell's attorney. She was quiet for a second. Then she set her pen down with the precise deliberateness of someone who doesn't want to show what they're feeling in their hands. Send him in. You want me to stay? She thought about it, which was more consideration than a simple yes or no usually got from her. Yes. He went back to the door and held it open. Croft came in with the manner of a man entering a room he planned to control, which was the manner of a man who had not yet spent enough time around Vivian Ashcroft to understand his mistake. He sat without being asked, placed his leather satchel on his knee, and opened it. He produced a document and set it on the desk in front of Vivian. My client would like to resolve this before the hearing tomorrow, he said. Vivian looked at the document without picking it up. What is it? A revised offer, 40% above the previous one, plus assumption of all outstanding debts on the property. Croft folded his hands. Mrs. Ashcroft, I'll be direct with you. The injunction may or may not be granted tomorrow. These things are uncertain. But regardless of the hearing's outcome, the legal process is going to be long, and the cost of maintaining this ranch during litigation. How much is your client paying you to sit here? Vivian asked. Croft paused. Per hour, she added pleasantly. That's not... because whatever it is, it's more than this visit is worth to me. She pushed the document back across the desk toward him. He can keep his offer. He can also stop his men from interfering with my water rights, which he won't, because that's the only leverage he has left. And then we'll see each other in the courtroom tomorrow. She stood up. I'll show you out. Croft didn't move immediately. He looked at the document, then at Vivian, with the expression of a man reassessing a problem he thought he had figured out. You should understand, he said carefully, that my client has resources for this kind of legal matter that... I understand exactly what your client has, Vivian said. What he doesn't have is the law on his side, which is what's going to matter tomorrow. She walked to the door and held it open. Croft picked up the document and returned it to his satchel with the same measured movements he'd used coming in. He walked to the door, He stopped. "This is a significant offer, Mrs. Ashcroft." "Good day, Mr. Croft." He left. Vivian closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment. Elias watched her let out a slow breath, the kind that's been held longer than it looks. "He came to rattle you," Elias said. "I know." She moved back to her desk. "Did it show?" He considered being kind about it. "A little, at the beginning." She sat down and pulled her papers back toward her. "Then it's good we practiced." He almost smiled. "We didn't practice. We practiced every time someone in the last 3 months tried to make me feel like I was in over my head and I didn't let them finish the sentence." She looked up at him briefly. "Same thing." He did smile at that, just at the edge of it, and looked away before she could see it clearly. They worked until late that night. Aldridge came in the afternoon and went through the case file one final time, pointed out 2 places where he wanted to strengthen the explanation of the historical water use record, asked Elias 3 specific questions about the surveying methodology he'd used to document the diversion structures, and left with the satisfied but never quite relaxed expression of a man who'd done everything he could and now had to trust the room. After Aldridge left, there was a particular kind of quiet in the house. The silence of things that have been prepared as well as they can be and now must wait for the morning. Vivian made tea instead of coffee, which was unusual. She sat at the table with both hands around the cup and stared at a point somewhere past the far wall. "Robert would have hated this," she said. Elias looked up from the notes he'd been reviewing. "Not the fight," she said. "The waiting." I was the kind of man who needed to be doing something every minute. Sitting still drove him to distraction. She looked at the cup. He was good at a lot of things. He wasn't good at patience. It was one of the most she'd said about Robert in months. Not the practical inventory she usually kept to, but something more personal, the kind of memory that surfaces when defenses are down. "What was he good at?" Elias asked. Carefully. Not trying to open something she wanted closed. She thought about it. "Horses. Better with horses than anyone I've ever seen, and he could make any room feel comfortable. Walk into a gathering of strangers, and by the end of the night, they all thought they'd known him for years." She paused. "That was a gift I don't have." "You have a different one." She looked at him. "You make people feel like what they're saying matters," he said. "Not comfortable. Something more useful than comfortable." She looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight, the tiredness in her face was visible in a way the daylight didn't usually permit. She was 29 years old, and she had been carrying this ranch for over a year, and it showed, not as weakness, but as a particular kind of weight that had become part of how she held herself. "Try to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be long." "I know." She didn't move. "Vivian." "I know," she said again, and this time she stood, and she picked up her cup and she walked to the doorway. She stopped there. "Elias." She said it without turning. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the judge decides, I need you to know that this year has been—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't think I'd still be standing at this point. I didn't know if I could." A pause. "I know now." He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have been the right size for that statement. She went to bed. He sat at the table for a long time after that, not reading anything, just sitting in the quiet with the lamp burning low. The courthouse in the county seat was a 2-story building of pale stone that had the self-important solidity of a structure built by people who wanted to convey permanence. By the time Elias and Vivian arrived the next morning, Aldridge already waiting on the steps. There were more people outside than Elias had expected. Calloway was there, which again surprised him. The old man had made the drive a second time. Deering and his 2 sons stood together near the door. Pratt was there, and 2 of the other ranchers they'd visited during the 3 days of rounds, and Harlan Pruitt, who Vivian had turned from skeptic to letter writer. There were others Elias didn't recognize, people who must have heard and come. Vivian stopped on the steps and looked at them. Calloway lifted one hand in a small acknowledgement. It wasn't dramatic. It was the gesture of an old man who had lived long enough to know when something mattered and wanted to show up for it. Vivian pressed her lips together for just a second. Then she squared her shoulders and went inside. Blackwell was already seated when they entered. He looked, at first glance, exactly like what he was. A man of 60 who had accumulated power the way some people accumulate property, steadily and without particular sentiment about the process. His attorney Croft sat beside him with the practiced stillness of a chess player calculating 7 moves ahead. They didn't acknowledge Vivian or Elias when they took their seats across the aisle. The judge was a woman named Hadley, which was not what Elias had expected, and which seemed, from Blackwell's brief expression when she entered, not to have been what he'd expected either. She was somewhere in her 50s, with the no-nonsense manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people trying to waste each other's time, and had developed a comprehensive intolerance for it. "We're here on the matter of an emergency injunction regarding water access to the Ashcroft property," she said, settling her papers. "I've reviewed the filings. I have questions for both parties. Mr. Aldridge, you filed. Make your case." Aldridge made it efficiently. The history of the water use, the documented diversion, the timeline showing Blackwell's legal filing came after every established date of lawful use in their record. He called Elias to give technical testimony on the surveying documentation, which Elias did with the flat precision of someone describing objective measurements, because that was all they were and that was all they needed to be. Numbers, locations, dates, the structural characteristics of an earthen dam that did not appear naturally. Croft cross-examined with the probing patience of a man looking for any crack in the methodology. He found a few things he could question. The exact point at which Elias's authority to conduct a survey on property he didn't own could be challenged, the chain of custody for some of the photographic documentation. But Aldridge had prepared for those, and the answers held. Then Croft presented Blackwell's counterargument, which was exactly what Deering's son had warned, that the Ashcroft claim, if upheld, set a precedent for privatizing water that had historically served multiple ranches, and that Blackwell's filing was a protective measure on behalf of the broader ranching community. It was, Elias had to admit, not a stupid argument. It was a lie wearing the clothes of a reasonable position, which was the most dangerous kind of argument, because it made the judge's job harder. Hadley listened to all of it with an expression that gave away very little. She asked several pointed questions about specific dates. She asked Croft to clarify the basis for Blackwell's claim of historical community use. And when Croft's answer relied on assertions rather than documentation, she noted that in writing without comment. She looked at the room. "I'm going to take a recess," she said. 30 minutes. The 30 minutes felt like 3 hours. People stood in the hallway in clusters, speaking quietly. Elias stood near the window and looked at the street outside. Vivian stood nearby, close enough that their arms almost touched, not talking. Blackwell passed them on his way to speak with Croft. He didn't stop. But as he passed, he looked at Elias, not at Vivian, specifically at Elias, with the appraising look of someone recalculating what they're dealing with. Elias held the look. Blackwell moved on. "He looked at you," Vivian said quietly. "I noticed." "What do you think that means?" "It means he's revised who the problem is." Elias looked back out the window. "He came in thinking the problem was a widow without enough resources. He's figuring out that's not what he's actually dealing with." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that good or bad for us?" "Hard to say. Smarter opponents make adjustments, but it's too late for adjustments. The case is the case." When Hadley came back in, and they all returned to their places, she didn't waste time. "I have reviewed the documentation thoroughly," she said. "The question before me is whether there is sufficient cause to grant emergency injunctive relief while the full water rights case proceeds. That question turns on 2 things: the strength of the existing use record and the nature of the alleged interference." She set down her papers. "The use record in this case is among the most thoroughly documented I have seen in a dispute of this kind. The interference with the water flow is supported by physical evidence, photographic documentation, and expert testimony on the surveying measurements. Mr. Croft's argument regarding community use precedent is noted, but it is unsupported by documentation, while the opposing record is extensively documented." She looked at Croft. "Your client filed a legal claim to the waterway after every date in the plaintiff's use record. I find that filing to be reactive rather than foundational." She looked at the room. "The injunction is granted. Mr. Blackwell's men are to cease any interference with the water flow to the Ashcroft property immediately. The full water rights case will proceed on the merits." A sound moved through the room, not loud, more like the release of breath that a group of people had been holding without realizing it. Blackwell didn't react visibly. Croft wrote something in his notes. Whatever they said to each other afterward, they said it quietly. Outside on the courthouse steps, Calloway shook Vivian's hand with both of his and said, "Good girl," which, coming from an 82-year-old man with 50 years on her, was not condescension, but something closer to a flag being planted. Deering slapped Elias on the shoulder once and said, "Good work," and Elias said, "Thank you for coming," and meant it more than those words usually carried. They drove home in the late afternoon, the valley opening up below them as they came over the ridge road, the ranch visible in the distance against the brown November land. The injunction meant the water would flow again. It meant the main hearing, when it came, would happen on their terms, with the record established, with the interference documented as fact. It didn't mean it was over. The full case was still ahead. But the shape of it had changed. Vivian didn't say much on the drive back. She looked at the land the way she looked at the cattle, reading it, checking it, measuring where things stood. When they came through the gate and Tate came out of the barn to meet them, she got down from the wagon and said, "Water situation should start improving by tomorrow. We'll check the North Creek in the morning." Practical, forward, already on to what came next. Tate grinned broadly, because he understood what the injunction meant, even if he hadn't been there to hear it. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and went back to the barn. That evening was quieter than Elias expected. He'd imagined, if the injunction went their way, something more, some moment of shared relief that expanded to fill the space the tension had occupied. Instead, the evening settled like any other. Supper, the table, the lamp, the paperwork now reduced somewhat from its previous mountain. It was Vivian who finally said something that wasn't practical. "He's going to fight the full case," she said. "Yes." "He's not going to accept this as a signal to back off." "No." Elias turned his coffee cup. "Men like Blackwell don't lose small. When they lose the whole thing, or they don't lose at all." She thought about that. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "It's supposed to be accurate." He looked at her. "The full case is winnable. More winnable now than it was this morning, because the record is established and the interference is now a matter of court record, not just our claim. Aldridge believes it. So do I." She nodded. Not relief exactly. More like a woman marking a waypoint on a route that still had distance to cover. "Tell me something," she said. "All right." When Croft came yesterday and made the offer, she stopped, started again. "For about 3 seconds, when I looked at that number on the page, I thought about it. I thought about what it would mean to not, to just..." She looked at her hands. "Walk away from it." He waited. "And then I thought about my cattle and this table and that creek running where it's supposed to run, and I couldn't." She looked up. "I couldn't. I don't know if that's strength or just stubbornness." "Probably both," he said. She looked at him sharply, then something in her expression eased. "Probably," she agreed. "For what it's worth," he said, "those two things are hard to tell apart in people who matter." She held his gaze for a moment. The lamp between them was burning low, the wick needing trimming, and the light it gave was uneven and warm. She looked away first. Outside, the temperature had dropped sharply, and through the window the stars were the hard, bright kind that only come on the coldest nights. Somewhere between the injunction hearing and this kitchen, autumn had finished its business and winter had arrived without particular announcement, the way serious things often do. In the morning, Elias rode up to the North Creek before anyone else was awake. He wanted to see it himself. The canyon was gray and cold in the early light, frost on the rocks, and his breath visible in short bursts as he picked his way down the bank. He heard it before he saw it, a sound he hadn't heard from this spot in weeks. Water moving at volume. The injunction had been served to Blackwell's property manager the evening before, and whatever work had been done to comply with it had been done overnight, and now the creek was running again. Not full force. Some of the natural flow was still reduced from the long interference. But it was running. The sound of it moved through the canyon in a steady, purposeful current that had nothing performative about it. It was just water doing what water does when you stop trying to stop it. Elias crouched at the bank and put his hand in, cold, clean, moving. He stayed there for a while. He wasn't a man who made large internal statements to himself, but he sat by the creek in the cold and he allowed himself quietly to feel what it meant. Not triumph. There was still a full case to win and nothing was settled, but something like rightness. The sense of something returned to where it belonged. When he got back to the house, Vivian was in the yard with Tate, both of them looking north toward the canyon with identical expressions of cautious hope. She saw him coming, and the question was in her face before she asked it. "It's running," he said. She closed her eyes for just a second. Tate said his breath that Elias didn't catch. Then Vivian opened her eyes and said, "Let's go check the north herd." They went. The weeks between the injunction and the scheduled date for the full hearing passed in a different rhythm than the ones before. Still hard, still demanding, but without the particular grinding anxiety of watching the water levels drop every morning. The cattle recovered conditions slowly, which was the only way cattle ever recovered anything. The two animals they'd lost were gone, and no amount of legal victories changed that, but the rest of the herd steadied. Aldridge prepared the full case with the methodical patience of a man building something he intended to last. He came to the ranch twice more to go through the record, asked additional questions of Elias about specific survey methodology that might come up under cross-examination, and interviewed Calloway by written correspondence because the drive had become too hard on the old man's joints in the colder weather. Blackwell was not idle during this period. Through Croft, he filed 2 procedural motions that were clearly designed to delay: challenges to the admissibility of certain historical records, a request for additional time to gather counter-evidence. Hadley denied the first. She gave a limited extension on the second, 2 weeks, with a pointed note in her ruling that further delay requests would be viewed unfavorably. "She's not fond of him," Aldridge observed when he reported this. "She's not fond of time wasting," Elias said. Same result. Blackwell also, through channels that were harder to trace, made another attempt at social pressure. This time it was more targeted, a conversation with the bank in the county seat that held a small note on Vivian's property, the kind of quiet word that suggests a customer's creditworthiness may be in question. The bank's manager, a cautious man named Fisk, sent Vivian a letter requesting a meeting. Vivian read the letter at the kitchen table with a steadiness that Elias recognized as the product of effort, not of feeling nothing. "He's persistent," she said. "He's running out of moves." Elias read the letter over her shoulder. "This is noise. Fisk isn't going to call a note on a property in the middle of a court case that's running in your favor. It's too visible." "Are you certain of that?" "Reasonably." He wasn't completely certain. He didn't say that part. "Meet with Fisk, bring the injunction documentation and a current livestock count. Show him the case is strong. He'll back off." She did exactly that. 2 days later, she came back from the bank with the same expression she had when a problem had been handled. Not pleased, not relieved, just moved past. "Fisk sends his regards," she said dryly. "I'll bet." What Elias didn't expect, what neither of them saw coming, was what happened on a Tuesday 3 weeks before the hearing. He was repairing a section of fence on the south property line when Tate came riding fast from the direction of the main road. Fast enough that Elias put down his tools and went to meet him. Tate pulled up hard, his horse breathing. "Man at the gate. Says he's from the county surveyor's office. Got papers." Elias felt something cold move through him that wasn't the temperature. "What kind of papers?" "He wouldn't say to me. Said he needed the property owner or her authorized representative." Elias mounted and rode back with Tate. The man at the gate was young, uncomfortable in his official manner, the way young men often are when they're delivering something they didn't create and don't endorse. He had a sealed envelope and a ledger for signature. "I'm the authorized representative," Elias said. "What's this?" "Survey dispute filing," the young man said. "Filed by Blackwell Land Holdings. Claims a boundary discrepancy on the northeast corner of the Ashcroft property. They're requesting a formal resurvey." Elias signed for the envelope. He didn't open it until the young man had left. He stood in the yard and read it once, carefully, then read it again. When he went inside, Vivian was already watching his face. "Tell me," she said. "Blackwell's filed a boundary dispute on the northeast corner," he said. "He's claiming that a section of the property you believe is yours is actually within his Creston parcel. If the dispute holds up, it would put the North Creek on disputed land," she said. She'd gotten there before him, which would complicate the water rights case. "It would muddy it, that's the intent." He sat down. "It's not a strong claim. The Ashcroft property lines have been recorded for 40 years, and the northeast corner has never been disputed. But a formal resurvey takes time, and if Croft can get it filed as a related matter to the water case, he might get a continuance." Vivian looked at the papers. Then she looked at Elias. You were a surveyor, she said, for 4 years. Could you conduct the resurvey? Not as a neutral party. I work for you. Any survey I conduct would be challenged on those grounds. She thought. Who's the most respected independent surveyor in this district? He thought. A man named Holt, out of Laramie. He testified in the Cassidy boundary case 2 years ago, and the court relied on his findings. Can we get him before the hearing? I'll ride to Laramie tomorrow. She nodded. Then she looked at the papers again, and something crossed her face that was not fear and was not quite anger. Something more like the exhausted recognition of a person who has been fighting on too many fronts for too long and has found yet another front opened on them. He keeps coming, she said. It wasn't despair. It was an observation. He's going to keep coming until he can't anymore, Elias said. That's who he is. But every move he makes now is defensive. He's not trying to win anymore. He's trying to delay. She looked at him. What's the difference? A man trying to win has a destination. A man trying to delay is already losing, and he knows it. He held her gaze. There's a difference in how you handle each one. She absorbed that. Her hands were flat on the table, a posture he'd come to recognize as her settling herself. Then we don't let him delay, she said. No, he agreed. We don't. He rode to Laramie the next morning before first light, a trip he hadn't prepared for, and that put him on the road in the coldest dark with only his own thoughts for company for the first 3 hours. He didn't particularly mind. He'd spent enough of his life on roads before dawn to have made a kind of peace with what they offered, which was mostly just the obligation to go forward and the quiet to think in. He thought about the case and the filing and the specific legal and surveying questions Holt would need to answer. I thought about the timeline and the money and the practical steps. He thought about Vivian at this table with her hands flat and her jaw set. He thought also about what he'd said in October, standing in the road with her, when she'd told him he didn't have to stay. I know what I'm staying for. He'd said it like a statement of fact. He'd meant it like one. He arrived in Laramie as the town was waking up, found Holt's office on the second attempt, and sat across from a square-faced man of 50 who listened to the situation with the focused patience of someone accustomed to untangling other people's messes. 40-year-old recorded boundaries, Holt said, never disputed until now. And the northeast corner specifically. Holt looked at the copy of Blackwell's filing that Elias had brought. He's claiming the original survey marker was misplaced. That's the claim. Holt looked up. How convenient that it took 40 years to notice. My exact thought. Holt leaned back. I can have a crew out there within 10 days. Survey like this on clear recorded boundaries. He made a brief dismissive gesture. I know what I'm going to find, but I'll find it properly so it holds up. That's all we need. My fee, we'll pay it. He said it before he'd thought about whether Vivian had authorized him to say it. Then he decided that was all right. Some decisions you made and settled with people later. Holt's crew arrived 8 days later. Elias worked with them on the northeast corner, providing his own historical knowledge of the property line and standing back while Holt conducted an independent verification that bore no trace of Elias's involvement in its methodology. When Holt presented his findings to Aldridge 4 days after that, they were exactly what he'd predicted. The Ashcroft northeast boundary was where it had always been. Blackwell's claim was without foundation in measurement or record. Aldridge filed a response to Blackwell's boundary dispute with Holt's survey report attached, and the judge, Still Hadley, who had by this point developed a visible and specific impatience with anything bearing Blackwell's attorney's letterhead, dismissed the boundary claim in 3 sentences. The water rights hearing date held. On the evening of that dismissal, Elias came back to the ranch late. He'd been at Aldridge's office, and then had stopped to water the horse and check in with Tate about the north herd, and by the time he walked through the back door, the supper hour was long past, and the kitchen was quiet. Vivian was sitting at the table. There was a plate set for him, kept warm under a cloth, and a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for. He sat down. He looked at the plate and the cup, and then at her. Holt's survey killed the boundary claim, he said. Hadley dismissed it. Vivian picked up her own cup. I know. Aldridge sent a message. He nodded. He pulled the cloth off the plate. They sat in the quiet. Through the window, the night was very dark and very cold, and the full hearing was 3 weeks away. She said, You rode to Laramie without asking me. He looked up. About Holt, she said. You just went. He held her gaze. You would have said yes. I know. She wasn't angry. She was looking at him with something more complicated than that. It's just, you went. You just... She stopped. You didn't even think about whether it was your decision to make. It needed doing, he said. I know it needed doing. She looked at her cup. That's not what I'm saying. He waited. She looked up. You're not a hired hand anymore, Elias. I don't know if you've noticed. He looked at her steadily. I noticed, he said. Something in the air between them settled differently after that. Not resolved. Nothing so neat as that. But acknowledged. Named in the small and sideways way that two people name things when they don't yet know how to say them directly. Outside, the wind had let up for the first time in days, and in that unusual stillness, the ranch was very quiet. The creek ran in the canyon northeast of them, lawful and clear, moving the way it had always been meant to move. 3 weeks until the hearing, everything they'd built for the past months pointing toward that room, that judge, that record. It wasn't over. Blackwell was still there, still powerful, still capable of surprises. But standing in the kitchen with a plate of food in front of him and Vivian across the table and the boundary claim dismissed and the water flowing and the case as strong as honest work could make it, Elias felt, with a clarity he hadn't asked for and couldn't argue with, that whatever came next, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He picked up his fork. He ate. The 3 weeks before the hearing didn't pass quietly. Elias had hoped they might, hoped that with the injunction holding, the boundary claim dismissed, and Blackwell's procedural maneuvers exhausted, the remaining time would be a matter of preparation rather than crisis. He should have known better. Men like Blackwell didn't become what they were by accepting the shape of things. They pushed at edges until something gave, and if nothing gave, they pushed at different edges. The first thing that happened was small, or looked small. A man named Garrett, who had provided written testimony about Blackwell's interference with his drainage 3 years prior, one of the 9 signatures in their documentation, sent a letter to Aldridge withdrawing his statement. No explanation, just a brief, formal withdrawal, written in language that didn't sound like Garrett's own. Aldridge brought it to the ranch in person, which told Elias the attorney considered it serious enough not to handle by messenger. We still have 8 statements, Aldridge said at the kitchen table. Garrett's was supporting evidence, not primary. The case doesn't fall without it. What happened to him? Vivian asked. Aldridge looked at his hands briefly. I don't know. I can speculate. Speculate. Blackwell holds a supply contract with the feed merchant Garrett uses, has for years. If that contract were threatened, Aldridge left it there. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Is there anything we can do? Not legally. He has the right to withdraw. And going after the reason why would take us into territory that damages our credibility more than losing his statement does. Aldridge looked at her steadily. I want to be honest with you, Mrs. Ashcroft. This is the kind of thing Blackwell is very good at. He doesn't always use force. Sometimes he just rearranges someone's circumstances until the easier choice becomes obvious. And we can't prove that, Elias said. We can't prove that, Aldridge confirmed. After he left, Vivian stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Outside, Tate was moving equipment in the yard, his breath making short clouds in the cold air. He got to Garrett, she said. Yes. Who else might he get to? Elias had already been thinking about this. The ones with business exposure to him are the risk. Deering's independent. His operation doesn't touch Blackwell's supply chain. Callaway's been retired from active commerce for years. Pratt's small enough that Blackwell probably hasn't bothered building leverage there. Probably. Probably, he agreed. He didn't insult her with certainties he didn't have. She turned from the window. I want to contact each of them directly, not through Aldridge. Me, personally. That could look like witness coaching. It's not witness coaching, it's... She stopped. It's making sure people know they're not alone in this, that we see what's happening. She looked at him. There's a difference. He thought about it. Keep it brief. Make it personal. Don't talk about the case specifics. I know how to talk to people, Elias. I know you do. I'm thinking about how it looks on paper if Croft tries to make something of it. She nodded, accepting the distinction. Brief, personal. She went to get her coat. I'll ride to Deering's today. You go see Callaway. The drive's easier on horseback than by wagon for that distance. He went. He found Calloway in his kitchen as before, moving slower in the cold months than he had in autumn, but with his mind as exact as ever. Elias didn't mention Garrett. He just sat and had coffee and let the old man talk about the case and about the valley and about the generation of people who had built it. And when he stood to leave, Calloway said, without preamble, "I'm not going anywhere. Tell her that." "I will," Elias said. "I knew her father-in-law," Calloway said, "and his father before him. That land has had Ashcroft water on it for 40 years, and it's going to keep having it." He looked at Elias with the direct gaze of a man who had outlived most of the people who'd ever doubted him. "You make sure that hearing goes right. We're going to try." "Don't try," Calloway said. "Do." Elias rode home in the late afternoon thinking about that. The simplicity of it, the old man's absolute lack of doubt. He wished he could borrow some of it. Not because he doubted the case, because he understood, from the surveying years, from the dispute that hadn't ended the way it should have, that right and winning weren't always the same coordinate on the map. Vivian had returned from Deering's by the time he got back. She was in the barn with Tate, doing the evening feed check, and when Elias came in, she looked at him over the back of one of the horses with the unasked question in her face. "Calloway's solid," he said. "Deering, too." She moved to the next stall. "His eldest son rode over from his own place while I was there. He'd heard about Garrett. He was angry. Angry helps as long as it doesn't tip into something we can't use. It won't. He's like his father. All of it goes into work." She came around to where Elias was. He said something interesting. He said Blackwell tried to buy his parcel 2 years ago, just like his father's, and that when he refused, within 3 months he lost a hay supply contract he'd held for 5 years. She looked at him. "Same pattern." "Same man," Elias said. "If we could get that on record, Aldridge would need Deering's son to testify to it. And it's civil damages territory, not water rights. But it shows a pattern. It shows a pattern that Hadley may or may not let in as relevant." He looked at her. "Talk to Aldridge. It might be worth trying to introduce. But don't count on it." She nodded. She was learning, over these months, the specific discipline of not building plans on things that might not hold. He'd watched her do it, revise, adjust, not abandon, but not over-rely either. It was a harder skill than it looked. The second thing happened 5 days before the hearing. Elias came into the main house late morning to find Vivian standing at the desk in the office holding a piece of paper. She wasn't reading it. She'd clearly already read it and was now just holding it, the way you hold something you need a moment to process. "What is it?" he asked. She handed it to him. It was a letter from a man named Sewell, who identified himself as a representative of an investment group out of Denver. The letter expressed interest in acquiring the Ashcroft Ranch at what it called a fair market valuation, and noted that the group was aware of the current legal proceedings and was prepared to offer terms that would include full assumption of legal costs to date. Elias read it twice, then he put it down on the desk. "Blackwell," he said, "has to be." Her voice was even. "An investment group that materializes out of nowhere 5 days before the hearing, knowing exactly what our legal costs look like. He's moved the money behind a different name. If you sell to Sewell, Blackwell gets the property through a holding structure, and there's no direct transaction to challenge. And I get out from under the legal fight, and whatever he's offered as a number is enough to make it look reasonable." She looked at the letter. "He's not even subtle about the timing. He doesn't need to be subtle. He just needs you to be tired enough." She looked at him sharply. "I'm not saying you are," he said. "I'm saying that's what he's counting on. Months of this, the water, the cattle, the injunction, the boundary claim, Garrett withdrawing, now this. He's stacking weight." He held her gaze. "Are you tired?" She thought about it honestly, which was something he'd always respected about her. She didn't perform an answer when he asked a real question. "Yes," she said. "I'm tired. I've been tired since October." "Okay. But tired doesn't mean I'm going to sell my ranch to a Denver holding company that Gideon Blackwell is hiding behind." She picked up the letter and put it in the desk drawer and closed it. "Write him back a polite decline. I don't want to spend words on it." He wrote the letter. He made it 3 sentences. She read it, made one small change to the second sentence, and signed it. They sent it with the afternoon rider, and neither of them mentioned it again. The night before the hearing, Aldridge came to the ranch for a final preparation meeting. He spread the full case record across the kitchen table. The documentation, the testimonies, the survey reports, the timeline of filings, Holt's boundary findings, and walked through it piece by piece in the methodical way he had, testing each element against possible counterarguments. Tate had made himself scarce after supper, gone to the bunkhouse with the instinct of someone who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. They worked until past 10. When Aldridge finally gathered his papers and his coat, he stood at the door and looked at both of them with the particular expression of a man who has prepared as thoroughly as he knows how, and is now at the point where preparation ends and the thing itself begins. "We have a strong case," he said. "I want you both to remember that in there tomorrow, regardless of what Croft does, he will try to make the room feel unstable. That's his skill. Don't let it become yours." "Understood," Vivian said. "Elias, you may be called on the surveying documentation again. Stay technical. Don't editorialize." "I know." Aldridge nodded. He looked at them one more time. This woman in her kitchen, who had held 5,000 acres together by willpower and documentation, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know its courage, and this man who had shown up for 6 weeks and stayed for a year. And whatever he thought, he kept it to himself. He said goodnight and went out into the cold. Vivian cleaned up the cups from the table. Elias stacked the papers they'd been working from and set them by the door for morning. Neither of them made any move toward going to bed. She stood at the window with her back to the room. "I keep thinking about the first time Blackwell came here," she said. "Not the last time, with the offer. The first time right after Robert died. He came to offer condolences." She said the word like she was holding it at arm's length. "He sat in this room and he said how sorry he was and how, if there was anything he could do..." She stopped. "And even then, 2 weeks after burying my husband, I knew. I could feel what he was actually there for." "You didn't act on it then," Elias said. "It wasn't a criticism." "I didn't have anything to act with then." She turned from the window. "I barely knew how to run this ranch. Robert had handled the water agreements, the land filings, the neighbor relations. I knew the cattle, I knew the daily work, but the larger architecture of it..." She sat down. "I've learned a lot this year." "You had already learned more than you knew before I got here." "Maybe." She looked at the table where the papers had been. "I've also learned that I made a mistake trusting certain people and not enough of a mistake trusting others." She looked at him briefly. "I was wrong about you at first." "How do you mean?" "When you first came, I thought you were like the others, someone who would work until it got hard and then find a reason to go." She looked at the table. "You stayed through every hard thing." He didn't say anything. "Why?" she asked. Not softly. She didn't ask things softly, just directly, the way she always did. He thought about what to say. He could say the practical version. The case needed finishing, the work wasn't done, any competent person would have stayed. He could say something deflecting. He could not answer, which he'd done before when questions got too close to something. "Because it mattered," he said. "The ranch matters. The case matters." He paused. "You matter." She looked at him steadily. In the lamplight, in this kitchen where they'd spent most of a year solving problems and drinking coffee and learning each other in the sideways fashion of two people who don't rush at things, she looked at him with the full attention she gave to things she was deciding. "That's the most direct you've been," she said. "It seemed like the right time." She was quiet for a long moment. "We have an early morning," she said finally. "We do." She stood. She walked to the doorway that led to the rest of the house. She stopped there. "Elias," she said, without turning. "Yeah." "After tomorrow?" She stopped. Started again. "After all this is settled, the case, the water, all of it, I'd like to have a conversation about what comes next." He looked at her back. "What kind of conversation?" She turned just enough to look at him. "The kind we've been not having for 4 months." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. She went to bed. He stood in the kitchen for a minute after she left. The lamp was burning. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of clear that comes before a hard freeze. He blew out the lamp and went to the bunkhouse and lay on his cot and did not sleep for a while. In the morning, they drove to the courthouse. The room was fuller than it had been for the injunction hearing. Calloway was in the back, next to Deering and his sons. Pratt sat across the aisle from them. Holt, the surveyor, was present as a potential witness. 3 or 4 faces Elias didn't recognize were there. ranchers from further out who had apparently heard enough to want to see how it ended. Blackwell sat at the plaintiff's table with Croft beside him, and this time Blackwell had brought 2 additional men in suits, whose precise function wasn't stated but whose presence was meant to communicate something about resources. Elias noted it and set it aside. Resources had never been the problem. The problem was a record, and the record was what it was. Hadley entered, and the room came to order. What happened over the next 4 hours was not dramatic in the way things are dramatic in stories. It was the slower, harder drama of a legal proceeding. The careful presentation of evidence, the methodical questioning, the objections and sustained and overruled, and the moments where the whole room waited for a ruling on an admissibility question before anyone could move forward. Croft was skilled. Elias had expected that. He pushed hard on the historical record, challenged the authentication of 2 of Calloway's oldest documents, questioned whether Elias's surveying measurements, conducted without official county sanction, could be considered authoritative. He made an argument about the scope of the injunction that was clever enough that Hadley set aside 10 minutes to consider it before ruling against him. Aldridge was steadier than clever, which was exactly right. He let the record do the work. He didn't over-argue. When Croft made a technical point, Aldridge answered it technically and moved on without heat. When the admissibility of Calloway's documents came up, Aldridge produced the authentication chain he'd prepared specifically because he'd anticipated this attack, and laid it out piece by piece until there was nothing left to challenge. Elias testified twice. The first time was brief. The surveying documentation, the measurements, the same material he'd presented at the injunction hearing, now more fully detailed. He was technical and dry and utterly precise, which was what the moment required. The second time was in response to Croft's cross-examination, which went after the independence question, tried to establish that, as Vivian's employee, Elias's measurements were inherently biased. "You were hired by and paid by Mrs. Ashcroft at the time of this survey?" Croft asked. "Yes." "And you personally had an interest in the outcome of the water rights dispute?" "I had an interest in an accurate measurement of what was happening to the water." "That's not what I asked." "I know." Elias looked at him without agitation. "I'm answering the question I can answer honestly. My interest was in documentation. The measurements are what they are regardless of who takes them, and Mr. Holt's independent survey, conducted without any connection to this property, confirms my measurements to within acceptable margin." He paused. "You can question my independence. You can't change the numbers." Croft moved on. Holt testified to his boundary survey findings, which were precise and completely demolished the boundary claim that had already been dismissed, but which Croft had tried to resurrect in a modified form. Hadley cut that line of argument off before it went far. Calloway's testimony was submitted in written form, which Hadley read into the record with a care that told Elias she found it credible. Then Croft made his closing argument. It was polished. It relied on the idea that the legal precedent being established was dangerous for the broader community, that private water claims, if upheld this way, would damage the collective water access that smaller ranchers depended on. He was persuasive enough that Elias watched 3 of the observers in the back shift in their seats. Aldridge's closing was shorter. He said, "The record shows 40 years of continuous documented use. The record shows an interference structure built on those established water rights. The record shows that Blackwell's filing came after every documented date of prior use. The law on prior appropriation is clear. The community use argument is not supported by evidence and is contradicted by the historical record, which shows the Ashcroft water use never interrupted any neighbor's established access." He said all of this in 11 minutes and sat down. Hadley took a recess. This one was 45 minutes. Elias sat in the hallway on a bench. Vivian sat beside him. She had her hands folded in her lap and she was looking at the floor, and she wasn't talking. He wasn't either. There was nothing left to say. The case was in the room without them now. Deering came and sat on Elias's other side after a while. He didn't say anything either. He just sat there, which was exactly the right thing. When they went back in, Hadley settled her papers and looked at the room with the particular expression of someone who has made up their mind and is about to be direct about it. "This case presents a clear record and a clear law," she said. "The doctrine of prior appropriation in this territory holds that the first user of water for a beneficial purpose has the right to that use as against later claimants. The evidence before me demonstrates, exhaustively and with proper documentation, that the Ashcroft property has maintained continuous and beneficial use of the waterway in question for over 40 years. She looked at Croft. The community use argument presented by the defendant is not supported by evidence and is contradicted by the historical record. No neighboring property has established a claim of interference with their water access that predates or challenges the Ashcroft use. She set down her papers. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Water rights to the creek and its documented tributaries are affirmed as belonging to the Ashcroft property under the prior appropriation doctrine. All claims by the defendant are dismissed with prejudice. She closed the record. The sound in the room was different this time than at the injunction hearing, bigger. Someone in the back, Elias thought it was Deering's eldest son, said something that wasn't a word and then caught himself. Calloway, in his written testimony that Hadley had read aloud an hour ago, had called the creek the lifeblood of the valley's northern quarter. And hearing that language in the judge's room had done something to the people in that room that was still visible on their faces. Blackwell stood. He straightened his jacket. He said something quietly to Croft. He walked out with his two suited men without looking at Vivian, without looking at anyone. Not in a hurry, not with visible anger, just with the closed, preserved manner of a man who is lost and is choosing how to carry it. Croft gathered his papers with the professional tidiness of a man for whom this was a job and not a cause. He looked at Aldridge once, briefly, with the acknowledgement of one craftsman for another's work. Then he left. The room broke into motion. Aldridge shook Vivian's hand and then Elias's. Holt came over and said something brief and complimentary. Deering's sons were talking in the corner. Pratt had found someone to speak to near the door. Vivian was very still in the middle of all of it. Elias came to stand beside her. She was looking at the judge's bench, which was empty now, just a raised desk in a stone room that smelled like old paper and varnish, and the particular institutional weight of a place where decisions get made. "It's over," she said. "The main fight is over." She looked at him. "There'll be more. He'll find another angle eventually." "Probably," Elias said. "But not this one. Not water. It's on record now." He held her gaze. "Every move he makes now has this ruling above it." She nodded. She turned and looked at the room full of people who had come because they gave a damn about what happened here, and her expression was the expression of someone who doesn't cry easily and is exercising that quality with some effort. Calloway had sent a message with Deering since the old man had stayed home this time. "Tell her I said the valley took care of itself. That's how it works." When Deering delivered it to Vivian in the hallway outside, she looked at the words for a moment and then folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket against her chest. They drove home in the early afternoon. The road back was the same road they'd taken that morning, the same bare winter valley, the mountains the same white above the line. About halfway home, Vivian said, "I want to look at the creek." "All right." "Not to check it, just—" She didn't finish the sentence. "I know," he said. They turned off the main road and went up the canyon trail, which was narrow enough in winter that they had to go single file. At the top where the canyon opened, Elias pulled up and Vivian came up beside him, and they sat there on their horses and looked at the creek. It was running well. The weeks since the injunction had let the flow recover most of its natural level, and in the cold air the sound of it carried clearly. Not spectacular, not dramatic, just water doing what water does when it's free to do it. She looked at it for a while. He let her look. "Robert used to bring me up here in the summer," she said. "When we were first married. He'd fish badly. He was a terrible fisherman and knew it, and I'd sit on that rock." She pointed to a flat-topped boulder on the far bank. "It was where I felt most like it was actually mine. The ranch, the land. Not his family's land that I'd married into. Mine." Elias looked at the rock. "I can see that. I wasn't sure for most of this year whether I was going to get to keep it." She said it plainly, not looking for sympathy. "I'm sure now." He looked at her. The winter light was flat and even, and it made everything clear, the way she sat her horse, the lines of her face, the quality of certainty in her that had been building through everything this year had put in front of her. "You were always going to keep it," he said. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know you, and you were always going to keep it." Something in her face that had been held carefully for a very long time shifted, just slightly, around the edges. "You said after all this was settled," he said, "we'd have a conversation." "I did say that." "It's settled." She looked at the creek. She looked back at him. The horses stood patient in the cold, breathing slow. "I meant what I said on the road in October," he said. "When you told me I didn't have to stay, I know what I'm staying for." She looked at him without the guarded quality she usually kept around anything that went past practical. "And what is that exactly? So we're clear on it." He looked at her for a moment. "You, the ranch, this." He gestured, not at the landscape exactly, at something that included the landscape but wasn't only that. "Everything we built this year." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt it. "I'm not easy to be around," she said. "I noticed. I have opinions about everything and I don't apologize for them. I noticed that too. And I've been running this ranch for over a year, and I'm not going to stop running it because there's someone else here." "I would never ask you to," he said. "I don't want to run your ranch, Vivian. I want to work it with you. There's a difference." She looked at the creek. She looked at him. "There is a difference," she said quietly. He waited. She turned her horse toward the trail home. She was almost past him when she stopped and looked back, and the expression on her face was the one he'd seen in glimpses all year, the one underneath the practical, underneath the guarded, the one that was just her, without armor. "Then stay," she said. Not a question, not quite a command either, just the truth of what she wanted, said out loud to the cold air, and the creek, and the one person she trusted enough to say it to. "And take care of it, and me." He looked at her for a moment. Everything he'd been carrying for months, the restlessness, the half-formed plans to move on, the careful distance he'd tried to maintain between himself and anything he might lose, sat very still. "All right," he said. They rode home together down the narrow canyon trail, single file in the places where the trail demanded it, and side by side where it didn't. The creek running audible below them all the way back to the flat ground, and the ranch in the distance getting closer with every step the horses took. They didn't tell anyone right away. That was the first thing Elias noticed about how it settled between them. Not with announcement, not with ceremony, but with the quiet adjustment of two people who had been moving towards something for long enough that arriving at it didn't require a great deal of noise. He stopped sleeping in the bunkhouse. He moved the few things he owned into the main house without discussion, set them in the corner of the room off the kitchen that had been used for storage. And the next morning came to breakfast the same as any other morning, except that the 20 yards between the bunkhouse and the back door no longer existed. Tate noticed within approximately 4 hours and said nothing, which was the most tactful thing Elias had ever seen the young man do. What changed, practically, was less than Elias had expected, and more than he could have described. The ranch was the same ranch. The work was the same work. The mornings started the same way, cold, demanding, with no patience for anyone who wanted to ease into things. But the quality of the days had shifted in some way that wasn't visible from the outside and couldn't be explained without sounding like something Elias wasn't comfortable saying out loud yet. He was present in a way he hadn't been in years, not just physically on the property, but actually, genuinely present. Not looking down the road, not calculating distance, not keeping one part of himself set aside and ready to move. It was unfamiliar enough that it took him a few weeks to stop checking for it, the way you keep reaching for something in a pocket after you've moved it somewhere else. Vivian, for her part, didn't make a production of any of it. She was not a woman who softened at the edges once she'd let someone in. What she did was include him, in decisions, in the thinking out loud that she'd always done, but had previously done alone, in the 3 a.m. conversations when something about the ranch woke her and she needed to talk it through. He came to understand that this was the most intimate thing she knew how to offer. Not tenderness, exactly, but trust. The full weight of the operation laid next to him and the assumption that he could carry some of it. He could. He did. January passed that way, and most of February. The wedding happened in early March, when the worst of the winter had broken, but the mud season hadn't yet made every road a negotiation. It was small, which was Vivian's preference, and also Elias's, neither of them being people who performed well in front of large gatherings when something actually mattered. Calloway came and sat in the front row of the chairs set up in Vivian's front room, and he wore his best coat, and he looked, for the first time since Elias had known him, genuinely pleased about something without reservation. Deering and his wife and the two sons came. Pratt came and brought a jar of preserved apricots from her summer stock as a gift, which was more personal and more useful than anything anyone else brought. Aldridge came and shook both their hands with the satisfied expression of a man who felt he'd had some hand in the outcome, which was not entirely wrong. Tate stood near the back and cried a little, which he denied afterward with the conviction of someone who believed sincerely that denial made it not have happened. The ceremony was brief. It said what needed saying. When it was done, Calloway raised his coffee cup. It was a coffee situation, not a drinking occasion, which suited most of the people in the room, and said, "To the Ashcroft Ranch," which is still standing. And everyone agreed that was the right thing to say. Afterward, when people had gone and the room was put back to rights, and Tate had been sent home with a cut of beef and explicit instructions not to appear before 7 the next morning, Elias and Vivian sat at the kitchen table, and it was the same table it had always been, and the same lamp and the same window showing the same dark. And they were different from what they'd been sitting here a year ago in a way that didn't need to be spoken. "We should talk about the spring," Vivian said. He looked at her. They had been married for approximately 6 hours. "The water rights are documented," she said, "but Aldridge thinks we should file for formal title certification before the season changes. And I want to rebuild the north fence line completely. The patchwork we did in October is going to fail in mud season." "All right," he said, "and I want to look at buying back the Pratt grazing lease we've been renting from her. If we own that acreage outright, we extend our south water access significantly." "How much is she asking?" "We haven't talked about a number yet. I wanted to think through whether it made sense first." She looked at him. "Does it make sense?" He thought about it. "Depends on the price. If she's reasonable, yes. The south access matters. If she's inflating because she knows we want it, she won't." "You're sure?" "She came to that courthouse twice." Vivian looked at the table. "People who do that don't then turn around and use your situation against you." He considered that. Fair point. She reached for a piece of paper. There was always paper on this table, always, and started writing something. He watched her. Her handwriting was even and clear and slightly too small, the way it got when she was thinking while writing rather than writing what she'd already thought. "What else?" he asked. "Cattle count in the spring. We lost 2 animals to the pneumonia, and we need to evaluate whether we build back to previous numbers or adjust. The north pasture water is restored, but the carrying capacity question is still—" She stopped writing. "Why are you looking at me like that?" He was. He'd been looking at her write and think and move through the next 6 months in her head, and he'd felt something that was somewhere between amusement and something more serious than that. "Because you're doing ranch accounting on our wedding night," he said. She looked at him. Then she put the pen down. Does that bother you?" "No," he said honestly. "It doesn't bother me at all." He paused. "I just want to make sure you know I noticed." She looked at the paper, then at him. "I know how to separate things," she said. "I'm making notes while I'm thinking about it so I can set it down." She folded the paper and put it to the side of the table. "There. Set down." He reached over and moved it to the counter, further out of reach. Something in her face relaxed, very slightly, in the way things relax when you let someone else carry the boundary for a moment. "Spring can wait," she said. "Spring can wait," he agreed. But spring didn't wait because spring never did. It came in the way Wyoming springs came, sudden and violent, and then abruptly warm, the snow coming off the mountains in a rush that turned every draw and channel into something that demanded attention. The creek ran at its highest level in years, which was a relief and a worry simultaneously, because high water was useful only until it became destructive, and Elias spent the better part of 3 weeks monitoring the north and east banks for erosion that could undercut the fence lines they'd repaired. He and Vivian rode the property together most mornings, which wasn't different from what they'd been doing all year, but felt different now, not in sentiment but in the way decisions got made. They talked things through on horseback, proposed things, disagreed occasionally, reached conclusions that belonged to both of them. He noticed that she was better at the long-range planning, and he was better at the immediate structural problems, and that between those two things, most of what the ranch demanded got covered without either of them carrying more than they should. He noticed also that she was watching him in the spring the way he'd watched her in the fall. Not obviously, But with the particular quality of attention that people give things, they're still figuring out how to rely on. He didn't say anything about it. He just kept showing up and doing the work, and being where he said he'd be when he said he'd be there, because that was the only thing that actually built the kind of trust she was testing for, and because it wasn't a hardship. It was, genuinely, where he wanted to be. Tate hired on permanently in April, which they'd both known was coming, but which required a formal conversation about wages and expectation that Elias handled, because Vivian's negotiating instinct ran toward blunt, and Tate was young enough to need some cushion around difficult conversations. They settled on a fair rate and a clear job description, and Tate shook Elias's hand with the solemnity of someone signing a treaty. "I want to learn surveying," Tate said, a few days after that, out of nowhere. They were mending the north fence line, Elias working one section and Tate working the next. Elias looked up. "Why?" "Because you knew things nobody else knew when all this started, about the water and the law and the measurements." Tate worked a post with the tenacity he brought to everything physical. "That's useful." "It is useful." "Could you teach me?" Elias considered it. "Some of it, yes. You'd need formal training eventually if you wanted to work professionally. But the basics, reading land, measuring, documenting." He looked at the fence line, the property stretching out beyond it. "I can teach you the basics." Tate nodded, satisfied. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Tate said, "She's different, Mrs. Vivian, since the case, since you—" He caught himself. "She's different." Elias didn't look up from his work. "How?" "Less—" Tate thought about it with the effortful consideration of someone who doesn't use words carelessly. "Less like she's holding something up by herself, like she's still doing the work, but the weight of it spread different." He drove another post. "It's better. She was running herself into the ground before." Elias worked the wire into the post. "Yeah," he said. "You were too," Tate said. "Just in a different direction." Elias looked at him. Tate kept working, with the expression of someone who had said his piece and wasn't going to belabor it. Elias went back to the fence. The formal water rights certification came through in May. Aldridge delivered it in person. He seemed to take a particular satisfaction in the tactile, physical reality of finalized documents, the way some people need to hold a thing to believe it's real. He laid the certificate on the kitchen table, and Vivian looked at it for a long time. "That's it," she said. "That's it," Aldridge confirmed. "Recorded, certified, filed at the county level, and with the territorial office. Anyone who wants to challenge Ashcroft water rights now challenges this document and everything behind it." He paused. "Blackwell could theoretically appeal, but the grounds are essentially gone. Hadley's ruling was thorough. Any appeal court would uphold it." "Will he appeal?" Elias asked. Aldridge thought about it honestly. "I don't believe so. He's a practical man, in his way. He knows when a position is spent." He looked at the certificate. "And frankly, the public nature of the case has made things more expensive for him than he anticipated. 3 ranchers who had been considering selling to him have pulled back. His reputation in this county has taken damage he can't easily repair." He picked up his hat. "Sometimes losing one fight costs a man more than the fight itself was worth." After Aldridge left, Vivian took the certificate to the office and put it in the files where the property records lived, the same cabinet where Robert's old documents had been, now supplemented by a year's worth of new ones. She came back to the kitchen and stood for a moment. "Your father-in-law would be glad about this," Elias said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It just seemed true. She looked at him. "Robert?" "I was thinking of his father, actually. Calloway said he knew him." She was quiet for a moment. "He would be glad," she said. "He fought for this land. He got it by working for it, not by inheriting it. He would have understood this year." She looked at the cabinet. "Robert would have been glad too. He just—" She stopped. "He would have handled it differently. More noise. More confrontation." A pause. "It would have gone badly." Elias didn't say anything to that. "That's not a criticism of him," she said. "It's just, I understand now that there's more than one way to fight for something. He only knew one." "Most people only know one," Elias said. "You knew a different one." "I knew the one that worked in this situation." He looked at her. "Different situation might have needed different." She looked at him with the particular expression she got when she was deciding whether she agreed with something or just wanted to agree with it. Maybe, she said finally, but I think there's something to the idea that knowing more than one way, that being willing to use documentation and testimony and law instead of just confrontation, I think that's not just situational. I think that's a kind of character. He was quiet. I'm not being sentimental, she said. I'm making an observation. I know you're not being sentimental, he said. I'm just… He looked at the window. Not used to people saying things like that about me. Then get used to it, she said, and turned back to whatever she'd been doing before Aldridge came. He stood there for a moment with the warmth of that sitting somewhere in the middle of his chest, making itself at home. The letter from Blackwell came in June. It arrived with the regular mail, unremarkable in its envelope, addressed to Vivian in a formal hand. She opened it at the kitchen table while Elias poured coffee, and he watched her read it once, then read it again. What is it? He asked. She set it on the table without comment and let him read it. It was not what he expected. It was not a threat, not a legal notice, not another attempt at purchase. It was a letter that occupied the difficult, narrow territory between acknowledgement and apology. Not quite either, but reaching toward something. Blackwell wrote, in the spare, structured sentences of a man unaccustomed to this kind of communication, that he had built his holdings over 30 years through methods he had considered simply practical and that he now understood had caused harm he had not accounted for. He wrote that the case had cost him more than the creek, which he had expected, but also things he had not expected. The regard of men he'd considered allies, the trust of people whose cooperation he now recognized he had taken for granted. He did not say he was sorry, but he said that he had spent 30 years acquiring and had ended the year with less than he started it in the ways that apparently mattered. He did not ask for anything. He closed with a single sentence, I believe you will manage this land well. Elias put the letter down. Vivian was watching him. What do you think? I think it cost him something to write it, Elias said. Yes. I think it's honest as far as it goes. He looked at the letter. It doesn't go very far. No. She took the letter back and looked at it one more time. But it goes further than I expected from him. She folded it. She put it in the desk drawer, the same drawer where she'd put Croft's settlement offer months ago, filed without ceremony. She didn't throw it away, which told Elias she thought it meant something. She didn't display it, which told him she wasn't sure yet what. Are you going to respond? He asked. She thought about it. Not yet. She closed the drawer. Maybe someday, when I know what to say. He understood that. Some things required time before you knew what they were, and rushing the knowing didn't make it come faster. Summer came to the valley. Summer came. Slowly and then fully. The land going green in the draws and along the creek banks. The cattle spreading out across the pastures with the specific contentment of animals with water and grass in abundance. Elias worked the fence lines and the water management and the 20 other things that a ranch at full capacity demanded. And he did it with the same attention he'd given everything here from the beginning, except that it was different now because it was his. Not in the legal sense. The ranch was Vivian's and always would be, and that was right. But in the sense that the land had become familiar to him, the way a known thing becomes familiar, not just recognized, but understood. Its problems and its temperament and its particular way of rewarding the people who paid it proper attention. He understood, that summer, what it meant to belong somewhere. He hadn't known, before this. He'd thought belonging was something you were born into or that you carried with you, some internal quality that either existed or didn't. He hadn't known it was something you built, slowly, with your hands and your decisions and your willingness to stay through the hard parts and come back the next morning and stay again. He thought about that on a July evening, sitting on the porch with Vivian after supper, the valley going gold in the long summer light. This had become a habit again, sitting out here in the evenings, which they'd done all the previous autumn and then lost in the intensity of the legal fight and the winter's demands and had gradually recovered in the easier months. She had a cup of coffee going cold beside her and a ledger in her lap that she was making notes in, because she was always making notes in something, and he had nothing in his hands and was just watching the light move on the mountains. Tate wants to learn tracking, she said without looking up, on top of the surveying. I know, he told me. Is there time? Probably not right now, fall, maybe. She wrote something. He's going to be a problem, she said, and he could hear the particular affection in it that she applied to things that gave her good trouble. Yeah, Elias agreed. A hawk crossed the lower sky, moving southeast, its wings barely moving in the evening air. Elias watched it until it cleared the ridge. I've been thinking about the Sewell letter, Vivian said. He looked at her. The Blackwell front from Denver. Yes. She closed the ledger. Not because I'd ever have sold, but because, when I read it, the thing that bothered me most wasn't the manipulation. It was the assumption that I could be made to let go. She looked out at the valley. That the right combination of pressure and exhaustion would make me release something I'd decided to hold on to. Blackwell miscalculated, Elias said. He miscalculated what I was holding on to and why. She looked at her coffee cup. He thought I was holding on to the property because I didn't have anywhere else to go. Because I was a widow who had inherited something and was clinging to it out of stubbornness or fear. She paused. He didn't understand that I was holding on to the life I was building, which is different. Elias looked at her. A property is something you own, she said. A life is something you make. She looked at him directly. He could have offered me enough money to buy another property somewhere easier. He couldn't offer me anything that replaced what was being built here. A pause. That's what he never understood. Elias thought about that, about the distinction she was drawing between having and building, between owning and belonging. He'd been on the wrong side of that distinction for the better part of a decade, moving between ranches, working other people's land, holding himself separate from the places he passed through because separate felt like freedom, and freedom felt like safety. What he'd discovered, slowly and without planning it, was that the freedom he'd been protecting wasn't freedom at all. It was just distance. And distance was the one thing that couldn't give you anything worth having. He thought this was about the ranch, Elias said. It was never about the ranch, she said. Not really. It was about whether I got to decide what my life was. She looked at him. And who got to be in it? He held her gaze for a moment. I'm glad you decided, he said. I'm glad you stayed long enough for me to, she said. They sat in the evening and let that sit between them in the easy way that honest things settle when they don't need anything more said about them. The valley was quiet except for the creek, which they could hear faintly from the porch. Not always, not in all weather, but in the still evenings when the air was right, the sound of it carried to the house. Elias had learned to listen for it the way you learn to listen for things that matter. It was the sound of something restored, of something that had been interfered with and had nevertheless persisted and was now simply running, unhurried and continuous, in the direction it had always been meant to go. He thought, sitting there, about the people who had made the year possible. Calloway and his 40 years of careful record-keeping, Deering and his sons, Pratt, with her preserved apricots and her testimony, Aldridge with his methodical, honest work, Holt with his survey equipment and his willingness to drive out in the cold. He thought about Tate crying at the wedding and denying it. He thought about Garrett, who had withdrawn his testimony under pressure and felt no particular anger about it, just the understanding that people measured their courage against their circumstances, and sometimes the circumstances were heavier. He hoped Garrett had found some way to square it with himself. He thought about what Calloway had said, sent in the message through Deering. The valley took care of itself. That's how it works. He hadn't entirely understood it when he first heard it. He understood it better now. What the old man meant wasn't that things worked out on their own, without effort. He meant that the valley, the community of people who had worked this land for generations, who had stakes in what happened here and memories of how it was supposed to be, that collective weight of investment in history, when it finally organized itself, was more than any single man with money and patience could overcome. Blackwell had been acquiring for 30 years. He'd done it piece by piece, quietly, buying individuals when they were isolated. He hadn't counted on the individuals deciding, when given the chance, that they weren't isolated at all. That was the thing about communities, the real kind, the kind built through decades of neighboring and water sharing and showing up when things went wrong. They weren't visible until they were necessary, and then they were very visible indeed. Vivian opened her ledger again. She wrote something, crossed it out, wrote it again. We need to talk about the fence materials for the East Line, she said. I know. And the North Herd expansion. If the water holds, it'll hold, he said. The certification was on file. The creek was running. Talk about it tomorrow. She looked at him. You keep telling me to wait until tomorrow. You keep doing ranch accounting at times when you could be sitting on your porch, he said. One of us has to push back. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the valley going quiet in the last of the light. She closed the ledger. Tomorrow, she agreed. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and set it back down. He stood up and took both cups inside and came back out with fresh ones, hot, the way she actually wanted it, and handed her one and sat back down. She looked at the cup. Thank you, she said. Sure, he said. It was the same exchange they'd had 100 times in the past year, the small, ordinary, repeated language of two people sharing a life. It never stopped meaning what it meant the first time. That was the thing about small things. They didn't accumulate and become ordinary. They stayed specific. You remembered the particular cup and the particular moment if you paid attention, and Elias had found, to his own surprise, that he was a man who paid attention. He had not always been. The years on the road had taught him to skim the surface of things, to engage functionally and disengage cleanly and move on before anything required more than that. He thought that was practical. He could see now that it was loss dressed up as efficiency. Every place he hadn't let himself belong to was a thing he hadn't gotten to keep, and the keeping was the part that mattered. The keeping was everything, it turned out. He looked at Vivian, who was watching the last light leave the mountains with the quiet attention she gave to things she cared about. He looked at the ranch in the dimming evening, the fences holding, the cattle settled, the creek audible in the distance, running the way it had run for 40 years and would run for 40 more. He looked at the work of the year laid out before him, not as something that was over, but as something that was now the foundation of everything that came next. He had spent a long time moving away from things. He had spent this year moving towards something. The difference was not subtle, and it was not small. A man who keeps moving tells himself he's free. But freedom that has no anchor, no place it belongs, no people it's accountable to, no work it cares about, is just another word for empty. Elias had been empty for years without a name for it. He had a name for it now, which meant he also had the thing it had been the absence of. The stars were coming out, the first ones, faint against the remaining blue. Vivian set her coffee down. She leaned back in her chair. She looked at the sky with the settled, slightly tired expression of someone who has worked hard and is now permitting herself to stop. "Good day?" she said. Not a question. He considered it. The fence work, the water check, the conversation with Tate about autumn training, the supply order he'd put together for the fall cattle push, the ordinary weight of a ranch running as it should. "Good day," he said. They sat in the dark coming down over the valley, the two of them on the porch of a house that was now both of theirs, on land that was certain and documented and hard-won and real, listening to the creek they had fought for running in the dark below the canyon rim. Neither of them moved to go inside for a long time. There was no particular reason to hurry. They had the evening, and they had tomorrow, and they had the long work of the life they were building, imperfect and demanding and interrupted constantly by weather and animals and the 100 things that went wrong on a working ranch, and exactly right in the way that things are right when they are true. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in the end, everything.